There is significant evidence that Nazi Germany had partially succeeded in reverse engineering downed extraterrestrial craft that had been discovered by Nazi authorities in the mid-1930s. The partly successful efforts by top Nazi scientists in understanding and reverse engineering this ET technology was a major factor in Nazi Germany's advanced weapons technology program and prolongation of the war effort in order to fully deploy these new weapons systems. At the conclusion of the Second World War, a top-secret effort to repatriate the same Nazi scientists in order to utilize their expertise was begun by U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps. Operation Paperclip, as this secret effort was called, involved the removal of hundreds of Nazi scientists to the well-funded military scientific laboratories created to produce weapons for the war effort. 39. A little-known figure in Operation Paperclip was a young German-speaking U.S. Army intelligence officer with a German-Jewish background, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was born in Fürth, Germany on May 27, 1923, and served in the Army Counterintelligence Corps from 1943–46. At the close of World War II, he stayed on active duty in occupied West Germany. He was assigned to the 970th Counterintelligence Corps Detachment, among whose official functions included the recruitment of ex-Nazi intelligence officers for anti-Soviet operations inside the Soviet bloc. Kissinger's detachment, in reality, was playing a key role in Operation Paperclip, a role that would mark him out in military intelligence circles as someone who had the keen intellect and strategic thinking abilities that could handle the most important strategic policy issue facing the U.S., how best to respond to the AT presence. 41. Kissinger returned to the U.S., and in 1947 began his university education as an undergraduate at Harvard University. Kissinger, however, retained his ties to the military, as a captain in the military intelligence reserves. This enabled him to continue to play a role in issues pertaining to the AT presence as the policy at the highest level of the Truman administration was being developed. By 1950, Kissinger was now a graduate student and was working part-time for the Department of Defense. He regularly commuted to Washington, as a consultant to its Operations Research Office, which was under the direct control of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Operations Research Office officially conducted highly classified studies on such topics as the utilization of former German operatives and Nazi partisan supporters in CIA clandestine activities. Kissinger's official duties were once again a cover for his role in coordinating the recruitment and utilization of former Nazi scientists in clandestine projects involving the reverse engineering of ET technology, and dealing with a range of intelligence and strategic issues surrounding the ET presence. In 1952, after completing his PhD, Kissinger became a consultant to the director of the Psychological Strategy Board, an operating arm of the National Security Council for covert psychological and paramilitary operations. Thus Kissinger's role expanded to dealing with the extensive policy issues surrounding the ET presence. Kissinger's inside knowledge of Operation Paperclip and the ET presence, combined with his strategic thinking abilities, marked him as someone who would rapidly assume a prominent position in the decision-making hierarchy surrounding the AT presence. As a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, Kissinger would undoubtedly have come to the attention of its most prominent members as someone who could provide leadership on how to respond to the AT presence. In 1954, President Eisenhower appointed Nelson Rockefeller his special assistant for Cold War planning, a position that officially involved the monitoring and approval of covert CIA operations. This was a cover for Rockefeller's true role as head of MJ-12 and most importantly, directing U.S. foreign policy in the wake of a secret treaty signed between an ET race from the Orion constellation and the U.S. The A treaty has been a source of much speculation, but its existence and content has been revealed by a number of former military and government intelligence whistleblowers. In 1955, Kissinger became a consultant to the National Security Council's Operations Coordinating Board, the highest policy-making board for implementing clandestine operations against foreign governments. Kissinger's analytical and strategic skills were used not only for coordinating U.S. policy in clandestine operations against foreign governments, but also for the clandestine operations against ET races. 44. Kissinger's role in the clandestine operations, his close relationship with Nelson Rockefeller, his intellectual abilities, all combined to lead to a steady increase in his influence. Rockefeller and others running clandestine organizations understood the danger in not coordinating clandestine policy towards ET races and reverse engineering, with the more conventional foreign policy issues that were the focus of public attention. Coordinating the extensive range of issues and problems would require someone with the strategic thinking abilities to coordinate these two arenas. Kissinger's abilities marked him out in the mind of Rockefeller, the Executive Committee from the Council of Foreign Relations, and military intelligence, as the person best qualified for this critical role. Rockefeller was instrumental in appointing Kissinger as one of the two directors of PI-40, the study group that would provide policy advice to MJ-12 in response to the treaty signed with the ET race from Ryan in particular, and the ET presence more generally. As a director and key strategist of PI-40, Kissinger would certainly have been aware of the need to politically manage the AT presence through ensuring the autonomy of MJ-12 and PI-40 and to render efforts of executive oversight ineffective. More importantly, MJ-12/PI-40 had steadily grown in institutional authority and power to the extent that it could now exert political influence over the executive branch of government, strongly influencing, if not outright control of, successive presidential administrations was viewed to be a critical part of how the AT presence had to be politically managed, effectively dismantling the executive oversight that was such a prominent feature of the Roosevelt and Truman administrations. What contributed to this need for MJ-12 to control, influence future administrations is the irony that while most policy national security officials, politicians, the news media and the public, believed that the Soviet Union was the primary threat to U.S. security, in fact the U.S. was secretly cooperating extensively with the Soviet Union in responding to the AT presence. This meant that beneath the official Cold War rhetoric and armed conflicts that consumed public attention and resources, clandestine cooperation was occurring against what was perceived to be a common threat. In short, the US and USSR were strategic allies as far as addressing the ET presence was concerned, while simultaneously being strategic competitors in the geopolitics of the Cold War. This meant that much of the animosity that characterized the Cold War was a charade that helped divert the general public away from what was really happening. Such a charade could only work if the most senior officials within the presidential administration were familiar with the ET presence, so as to moderate more bellicose policymakers who believed the Cold War was for real, and were fully ready to use nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union in response to a perceived attack. Influencing successive presidential administrations could be achieved by embedding key PI-40 members in senior policy positions of incoming presidential administrations so as to ensure non-disclosure of the ET presence, and moderating Cold War hostilities. For the Kennedy, Johnson administrations, this individual was McGeorge Bundy, one of the original members of PI-40, who upon becoming National Security Advisor would have become the chair of MJ-12. In the case of the future Nixon administration, this would be achieved by embedding within it an even more prominent PI-40 member who could control President Nixon when necessary. For the Nixon administration, this person would be no other than Henry Kissinger, who was plucked out of public obscurity in 1968 to be appointed National Security Advisor of President-elect Nixon. The instrumental figure in Kissinger's appointment was Nelson Rockefeller, who had lost to Nixon in the 1968 Republican Convention, and subsequently arranged for his Prot. A copyright G copyright to become part of Nixon's team. 48. Kissinger was intent on centralizing foreign policy making in the White House and the National Security Council, thereby ensuring him a central role in shaping not only U.S. foreign policy, but also clandestine policy towards ET races in his new role as director of MJ-12. Given his long history as a director of the Special Studies Group /PI-40 since its formation, Kissinger would have been the most experienced and powerful head of MJ-12 since Nelson Rockefeller. In Seymour Hersh's critical biography of Kissinger's political managerial style during the Vietnam era, what emerges is that Kissinger was intent on amassing as much power as possible in managing international affairs. 50. Kissinger systematically undermined the positions of others who could pose a threat to his control of international affairs, especially that of the new Secretary of State, William Rogers, and other key policy makers in the Nixon administration. 51. Kissinger emerges in Hersh's biography as a political figure paranoid about ceding power to others who in his view lacked the subtlety and acumen in dealing with critical foreign policy issues. Kissinger's managerial style was to ensure that all information passed through him as the principal filter for shaping Nixon's priorities and thinking on foreign policy. A passage from a former Kissinger aide, Morton Halperin, reveals Kissinger's political managerial style. On January 25, 1969, 5 days into the administration, the NSC was convened for its first meeting. The issue was Vietnam, and Halperin, now clearly Kissinger's top aide, was assigned to summarize all the papers and prepare a covering memorandum for the president. He carefully listed the various options in the 2- or 3-page summary, leaving boxes for the president to initial his choices. The idea was to reduce the president's workload. If Nixon chose not to read the attached documents, he could merely review Halperin's summary, which, of course, came with Kissinger's imprimatur, and make his decision. Henry loved summary and thought it was terrific. But, Mort, he said, you haven't told the president what options we should choose. I thought to myself, Halperin recalls, we're not supposed to be giving positions, we're just supposed to send summaries of the options. Years later, Halperin would realize how Macron he had been. Henry had been publicly saying that we were just going to sort out the issues for the president. I didn't know that Henry wanted to give him the decisions he should take. I was surprised because I still believed what Henry had said. The Kissinger summary papers, with their recommendations, would become the most secret documents in the Nixon White House. Kissinger's political managerial style while in government is very significant since it provides insight into how decision-making in PI-40 was conducted under Kissinger as the study group director, and later in MJ-12 when he became its head during the Nixon, Ford administrations. Kissinger's role in guiding U.S. foreign policy was dictated by his philosophy of a realpolitik. Realpolitik was modeled after his favorite international statesman, 19th-century German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, who skillfully managed international alliances and limited wars to transform Prussia, Germany into a great power without provoking an international alliance against Germany. 54. For Bismarck, international politics was a grand chessboard where morality and sentiment played at best a secondary role, and what really mattered was the skillful use of one's resources in achieving one's strategic objective of maximizing power. A realpolitik dominated Kissinger's approach to international politics as evidenced in places such as Laos, Cambodia, Chile and East Timor, where morality and sentiment played no role in these countries' treatment as pawns in the grand game of international chess, where the US competed with the Soviet Union to maximize its geopolitical power, while simultaneously cooperating strategically in responding to the AT presence. Little known to the general public, however, Kissinger adopted the same role in steering U.S. policy in how it would respond to the AT presence. Morality and sentiment would play at best a secondary role as the U.S. gradually improved its resources in order to increase its strategic position vis-a-vis the AT races visiting Earth. The moral orientation of these ET races that interacted with humanity and the clandestine organizations that were aware of ET activities were not given great emphasis in Kissinger's realpolitik concerning the AT presence. What mattered was the extent to which ET races would provide resources for US clandestine organizations to improve their weapons technology and thus improve the US's strategic position vis-a-vis different ET races.
Kissinger's realpolitik was the way in which the complex political, social, economic and environment issues would be managed vis-a-vis the ET presence. Kissinger's role would be similar to his 19th-century hero, Bismarck. Kissinger would play a key role in transforming the US into the dominant global power that could deal with ET races as an equal, without sparking a damaging interplanetary war with one or more of the ET races that would spell the end for US sovereignty and freedom. Kissinger's close association with the Rockefeller family ensured that corporate America would continue to play a prominent role in the political management of the ET presence. With Kissinger, during the Nixon administration, simultaneously playing prominent roles in U.S. foreign policy and its clandestine interplanetary policy through MJ-12/PI-40. What emerges is that the political management of the ET presence was dominated by a few individuals intent on amassing as much institutional power as possible, and not delegating authority to those outside of MJ-12/PI-40 who were viewed to lack the necessary experience, political sophistication and intellect in dealing with the complexities of the ET presence. Eisenhower's warning that the political management of the ET presence was not in the best hands now appeared prophetic.